All right, welcome everybody. I'm very happy to see that some of you found the way here, even though the weather is beautiful and there are a lot of alternatives in Berlin. But we have a very interesting event here tonight. And next to me, you see Anna Bojatyevska. She is like Senior Project Manager at Robert Bosch Foundation. And she will give us a bit of background on this event today, which is about the presentation of a study on the political participation of refugees that Robert Bosch Foundation implemented in close cooperation with IDEA. So we'll hear more about that in a minute. So Anna, thank you very much for making that event possible. And maybe you could start by giving us a bit of background on why Robert Bosch Foundation actually decided to engage in that topic.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thank you for overtaking the moderation and guiding us through this event today. To start with, I would first really like to welcome you all on behalf of the Robert Bosch Foundation. I'm actually very glad to be here and discussing this study, which a lot of people have been working on in the past 1.5 years, maybe. So it's, after such a process, finally nice to have the moment when this goes out in the world. On the why is this project important for the Robert Bosch Foundation? The foundation has been, one of the focus area of the foundation is migration, integration, and participation, and inclusion. And mostly our colleagues from the society department, they have been very active on this topic in Germany, supporting the integration and inclusion on migrants and refugees, but also very much engaging or providing platforms of people to engage on policy debates on these issues. In the international relation programs, we are very much concerned with international cooperation and understanding when it comes to global questions. So this is where migration comes on the side of international programs where I personally work. And what is important for us is not only for people who work within the international affairs sphere, but also very much for policymakers and for citizens who work and are engaging on the national level, is to have more international perspectives on the issues that they're dealing with. We believe that it's important to have understanding of what is happening with refugees and their rights in Uganda, in Kenya, or in different other parts of the world as well, because it's a global and interrelated topic, to say it very bluntly. So this was our entry point where this became interesting to us, and our colleagues from internationally, they approached us with the idea to do this study. And we were thrilled immediately because we thought this is a very relevant issue that has been very, very little explored. So that was our entry point, basically. And you asked me what is the objective. I think we can discuss the objectives because there are several of them throughout the event, but just to put it on the meta level, I think for us the biggest objective is putting this topic of political participation of refugee in the discussion on democracy that we're having. Because in Europe, but also beyond, it's becoming more relevant on how our democracies look like. Refugees and migrants not necessarily are discussed a lot in terms of what is their access to participation, but we believe that this is also part of the topic, because you can only strengthen democratic systems if you strengthen vulnerable groups and people who are excluded from this process. Which I'm not saying that refugees are the only such group, but they're in any case an important one. And to us as a foundation is of course also important to bring up new issues that have been maybe neglected in policy debate, but also in research. So that's why this report.
Okay, thank you very much. And you're already hinting at that some of the aspects of the project are new for you also as foundation. What might be an innovative aspect also about that project in the way it was conducted? And
Well, to start from the most important aspect, at least on my behalf, is this project, not that our other projects are not focusing on that, but this project is very much focused on the human dimension of it. Because it is about analyzing the framework, it is about seeing what are the factual and legal possibilities, but in the end of the day, is about discussing or letting refugees have a say on how they see political participation in the first place. What does it mean to them? The second point is that I think this study is a very comprehensive one. There is very little, if none, research out there that basically compares, that integrates and compares across countries the possibilities to participate within hosting countries, but at the same time looking at refugees and transnational actors who also are able to affect the political system in their own country. So it kind of bridges the debates on national level on integration, but on the other hand, looking into refugees as potential actors of democratization, of peace building, etc., in their own countries. And the third and final point that I would like to emphasize today is that it is a study that compares one issue across the, so to call them, global south and global north. I think that the debate that we have been having in Europe on refugees has been also very Eurocentric. So for us, it is also interesting to show out that these questions are also present in other parts of the world, and to show this interconnectedness.
Mm-hmm. And that's very visible in the selection of host countries and countries of origin that you undertook. We will hear more about that later when our colleagues enter the stage. But maybe, Anna, also from your perspective, if you now look at the study process, it's been 1.5 years. So how happy are you with the study results and with how it all went?
Mm-hmm. Well, I have two answers to this. I had one. And to start with this one, we're of course very happy in terms of the results and the products that are out there. Especially because this report outlines, summarizes the debate, outlines clear recommendations, etc. But I think it really shows different facets. It shows the complexity of the issue in many terms, not only from the legal perspective, but also as used by refugees themselves and the internal questions and dilemmas and difficulties they have. So in that perspective, I think it's very valuable. It answers some questions, but it puts new questions to be discussed and further research. So I think that's very valuable. And my second answer would be, because I was chatting with one of the researchers after we came, Schweib, and he reminded me what do we do with the reach out of this report? Because in the end of the day, when all the researchers were in the field, they were asking, will this something change for me? Because in the end of the day, we talked to more than 600 refugees in different countries. They all invested their time and efforts to discuss this with us. And at the end of the day, the question is, will this change something? So I think that's the second level of results that is in the period to come, to see how many people get interested by this. Do we manage to present it in important different platforms?
And you've been collaborating closely with IDEA in that project. Why did you pick them as a partner, and what did that partnership consist of?
This partnership consisted of a very pleasant cooperation throughout, throughout the previous months. So therefore, I would, before I go a bit in the reflection on this, I would really like to thank Lina and Armand, but also all of their colleagues in International IDEA for really dedicating a lot of time, efforts, but also a lot of emotion to this project, and a lot of researchers that took part in it. And for us, IDEA was, of course, a very interesting project partner, because on one hand, they're intergovernmental organization, and on the other hand, they see themselves in a way as a think and a do tank. And they had this comprehensive approach for really thinking through the research and the results, but also considering very much governmental perspectives, considering, okay, what is the actionability of this? And for us as a foundation, who would we really like to support not only research, but also this research coming out there somehow. Of course, it was a very, very important segment in our cooperation.
Perfect. So if you look now at this, we have just 2 hours to dive into a pretty complex topic. And of course, a bit of time later to discuss informally. You invited us on a small entree later. But what would make these 2 hours a success for you, Anna? Like, when would you say, okay, that was a good launch?
It's interesting question, because it will accompany us, I think, on all the discussions that we're gonna have further, also on the project. I think of one hand, of course, for us is also the goal a bit to reflect on the research process, to reflect on the results. But I think even more valuable it is that from the people that are sitting in this room, many of them are really close to this topic on the ground. So for me, it would be a success if we really also do kind of a double check, like are we raising the important questions? Are there stuff that we have been missing out? Are there questions that are, or theses that are presented with the report but maybe are seen differently? Like I would wish, I don't know, an honest conversation about it.
Very good. Thank you very much, Anna, and we'll talk more a bit later. But for the time being, thank you so much for being the host and for making that event possible.
Thank you very much, and I wish us all a very nice event.
All right. So, I'll give you a quick overview of what will follow before I invite our second speakers up. We will now get a short introduction on the most important study results by Lina and Arment that have been already introduced a bit here by Anna. They will use 5-6 slides just to run us through the most important results, because of course we don't expect that you all already read the study in depth, even though it's available outside. After that, we have 5 panelists that will help us to understand a bit better the core findings and to discuss them out of various perspectives. And we will open the panel discussion after roughly 1 hour to allow, of course, an open debate here in the audience, and have a conclusion and outlook at the end by Idea again, like giving us a bit an overview of what's next in the process. And after that, you're all invited for a small reception. So, Lina and Arment, you've been already announced, so I welcome now Arment Bekash and Lina Antana from Idea to give us a bit an overview of the study findings. So, is it on? Yes, that works. You have a microphone? Yeah.
Is it? Yes.
So, we already heard there were like a lot of, there were I think 8 host countries in the research. There were 5 countries of origin, so that looks pretty complex to me. So how did you actually approach that methodologically?
Well, first of all, good afternoon, good evening, all of you, and thank you for being here. And I want to say, on behalf of International Idea, a big thanks to the Robert Bosch Stiftung and to Anna in particular for the excellent collaboration. I will try to run through the methodology very quickly. So how did we do it and why we selected these countries? In this table, you can see the 8 host countries where the research was conducted. And as you see, we selected countries that are in Europe, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and in the MENA region, because we wanted to show a comparative perspective from different countries with different political, social, and economic conditions. And we have focused on refugees coming from 5 origin countries, namely from Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia, South Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC. The way that we have selected these countries was, first of all, we selected the origin countries based on a statistical analysis. So we saw which were consistently in the last 5 years, which were the countries that were among the top 10 sending countries. And then we looked also at the absolute numbers or the relevant numbers, the percentages of refugees from these origin countries that are present in these host countries. And as you see, we have tried to keep a gender balance between male and female refugees that were interviewed in each country. Our researchers did the interviews based on a standard questionnaire that we had developed. And depending on the conditions on the ground, they did either focus group discussions with a small group of refugees or face-to-face, more in-depth interviews. And in the end, we managed to have a sample of 615 refugees in total and 23 key informants involving civil society organizations, NGOs, government officials, and experts that work on refugee issues in the selected host countries.
Okay, thank you very much. So, if I understand correctly, you're distinguishing between 2 major forms of participation. I mean, there is like formal participation and there are informal ways of political participation for refugees. And for the formal participation, the process of naturalization of citizenship is, of course, a key process. How does that differ across these 8 countries?
Thank you, Christian. Is this working? It is. Very pleased to be here myself. And as you will see in the report, essentially what we've done is we've looked at formal means of political participation of refugees as well as non-formal means of political participation. As far as the formal means of political participation is concerned, there are various ways in which a refugee can get engaged politically in the host countries in which they are residing. And one of the ways, which is very often we found out a precondition almost for a meaningful political participation in a formal manner, is basically access to citizenship. And what we try to do with this slide here is to simply just sort of narrate it a little bit, the difficulties, the hindrances that a refugee usually encounters from the point of arrival in a host country, regardless of which country that is. It can be any of the countries that we've mentioned before and that are also analyzed and compared in the report that you have in front of you, until they reach the stage of getting citizenship. Why is this important? It is important, we found out, because it is very often the only way for a refugee to be able to have their voices heard directly in politics in the country where they are residing. We make reference, for instance, to Article 34 of the Refugee Convention in the report, which essentially urges member states to do more, to proactively do more in terms of naturalization, offering naturalization to refugees that are living in the midst as a way of them having a more meaningful role in the politics in the countries where they are residing. And so there are different ways in which the host countries are practicing access to citizenship, and we'll go through some of the examples later on, particularly with the panelists that we have with us here today. But it is, in essence, we found out, regardless of which country we are talking about, as a host country, it is the precondition for a refugee to be able to meaningfully participate politically in the country where they are residing. Access to citizenship and naturalization, essentially.
Perfect. If we look at, okay, that was like one process, the naturalization process, and it is, of course, closely connected to voting rights, no? Electoral rights also.
Exactly.
How is that usually governed, and what type of mechanisms exist here in the 8 countries that you studied?
So what we found, as Armand rightly said, access to citizenship of the host country is usually a necessary precondition for having electoral rights in the host country. Out of the 8 host countries that we looked at, Sweden was the only exception because it allows voting for any resident non-citizen, including refugees that have resided in the country for a continuous period of 3 years. So citizenship is not a necessary condition for being able to vote in the local elections. But in all the other cases, the refugees have to wait. They have to wait and they have to fulfill the conditions until they naturalize. And what happens after refugees have naturalized? We have found that some of the key challenges in their effective participation in the formal political processes are related both to legal and to practical, but also to cultural reasons. For example, throughout the case studies, we found that the lack of or the limited information and understanding of how the political system works in the host country can pose a significant barrier in the motivation or in the way that refugees who have obtained voting rights may or may not access the polls. We also found that language barriers, and that is a natural, that was not an unexpected finding. And language barrier can be a big challenge, not only for the political integration, but also for the social and the labor integration. And then a more general feeling of marginalization that refugees usually experience in the host countries. As it was characteristically mentioned by one refugee respondent in Turkey, he said, I do not feel part of the host society, so I do not feel that I have the legitimacy to go and vote. Even if I was given this formal right, I don't feel part of the host society. So this feeling that refugees are not part of the host society, but they are somehow living in a living parallel lives is also a very significant deterrent factor in their motivation to participate. Then we also found in many cases that negative experiences from politics in the origin country are limiting a lot refugees to participate either formally or non-formally in the host country. And as it was characteristically said by one South Sudanese refugee that was interviewed in Kenya, he said, bad politics took us out of our country. Why start again messing with bad politics in the host country? Let us enjoy the peace and the freedom that we have here. So that is a very characteristic statement of why the experiences from the origin country play a big role. And lastly, the lack of awareness sometimes can be a very important issue. Lack of awareness of why it is important and why their voice and their vote can count and should count in the host country elections.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. But there are not only these formal ways of participation in the political process, no, Armand? I mean, you investigated also informal ways of political participation of refugees. What does that entail?
Right. So, what it was important for us to do is also look at the so-called non-formal means of political participation for various reasons. One reason is that it's not just through formal mechanisms that one can participate politically, whoever that person might be, refugee or otherwise. And also non-formal ways of political participation are just as important, particularly in today's world, in a more globalized environment with social media, with civil society activism, transnational activism, and so on and so forth. And this is particularly, we found out this is particularly relevant for the refugees, precisely because of that reason that we mentioned at the beginning, which is that very often refugees don't have the mechanisms, they don't have the means, the ability or the right to participate politically through formal means of that participation. And so for that reason, we looked at the non-formal means of political participation. We'll talk about some of the other means a bit later on. Right now, I will just quickly touch upon the so-called consultative bodies or the consultative committees, which is, and I'll use an example. It's the example of Germany, since we are here today. And in reference to a convention which was passed by the Council of Europe in 1992 and then enacted in 1997, it is a convention which calls upon member states to form consultative bodies at the local level, which would offer a mechanism for refugee communities at the local level to participate, to have their voices heard, basically. And so Germany is a good example in that direction, because in various states in Germany, we've seen that different cities, different local authorities have done quite a lot of work in proactively reaching out to through grassroots means and initiatives, reaching out to the refugee communities at the local level and creating these consultative bodies, which are comprised of local authorities, but also representatives of the refugee communities themselves, with the idea of basically offering them an avenue to express their interests and at the local level, but also to advocate for their rights at the local but also national level. So that is the positive aspect of it. A minus, if I may say, of these bodies is that they don't have an executive function. They have an advisory role. Having said that, Germany and the states where this happens is definitely an example of how these consultative bodies can play an active role in terms of offering refugees a voice to be heard, at least at the local level, through means which are not necessarily traditionally formal in the way that they communicate with authorities.
Okay, so we've looked now at the host country context, basically, but of course, refugees were also actively engaged and are, through diaspora organizations, actively engaged in their countries of origin. So how did the study, or which aspects did the study look at when we look at political participation in the countries of origin?
Thank you for bringing up the issue of the origin country, because I have to say, as Europeans, sometimes we tend to think that Europe is the center of the world and that there is nothing else besides Europe. But in fact, considering the origin country context, I think, is very important. And this is what we try to do through this study, is to consider that refugees are still citizens of their origin country. They left due to conflict, due to political reasons or for other security reasons, but there is possibility of repatriation, there is possibility they still retain the citizenship, there is possibility of having an impact in the stabilization of the country, in the reestablishment of the peace and democracy in the origin country. So we looked at again, formal and non-formal mechanisms of participation. Maybe just very quickly, a few words about the formal mechanisms. We looked at the out-of-country voting, the OCV, and out-of-country voting regulations exist in 2 of the 5 countries that we examined, in Afghanistan and Syria. And we have looked at the legal aspects, but also the practical aspects for the participation of refugees that are based in a host country to electoral processes or to government institutions in their origin country, either by going back or by being candidates while holding dual citizenship. And a very interesting and quite positive example here is the example of the Somali diaspora. The Somali diaspora that is very strong. Many of the Somali refugees that fled the conflict that started in 1991 have become citizens. In the example of the Somalis interviewed in Sweden, we saw that the Somali diaspora had maintained very strong links with the origin country. They sometimes establish civil society organizations and NGOs in the host country, but implementing projects or funding projects in the origin country, doing capacity building and skills building and leadership courses or civic education courses, and basically trying to transfer democratic ideals and democratic values back in the origin country. But also, very interestingly, in the recent Somali elections in 2016 and 2017, the diaspora seems to have played a very important role. Actually, out of the 32 presidential candidates, more than half of them had a dual citizenship. And then the president that was elected was Somali and American. So this is a very interesting example of refugees that continue being involved with dual citizenship, that continue being involved in the origin country politics. And when the opportunity comes, they can go back and they can play an important role in the governance of their country. But also when we speak about non-formal, when we go back to the non-formal means, we looked at the civil society organizations, the protest movements and the grassroots initiatives, which are led or run by refugees. And they try to raise awareness about the issues in their origin country. They also try to put pressure on the international community and on the host country about finding a solution to the protracted conflict in the origin countries. And one very interesting case, and maybe Shoaib later will say a few words about it, is the case of social media activism. As one Afghan refugee in the UK characteristically said, technology has helped us overcome the barriers of our refugee life, because now we can connect with our origin country. So we saw that in many cases, social media and online political activism also played an important role in keeping up to date with the developments in the origin country and voicing and mobilizing the concerns of the diaspora.
Okay, thank you for the overview. Like, if we now look at the 8 case studies that you conducted, you've also tried to draw some lessons learned and recommendations, basically, no? What are key aspects that you have focused on in these recommendations?
Yes, thanks, Christian. So we said at the beginning that I think what makes this report maybe stand out a little bit from the other reports and research initiatives that are out there is the focus, the specific focus on political participation, right? There are a lot of analyses and reports with the focus on security aspects, humanitarian aspects of asylum seekers and refugees. And whilst that is a very relevant, these are very relevant topics, particularly considering the risks that asylum seekers and refugees might be facing, we decided to look at this component alone, which is political participation. So that is the niche, if I can put it that way, of this report. Having said that, in the end, we ended up with a number of recommendations, which you can sort of read in more detail in the report. We have a couple of them which we sort of wanted to share with you here, and they are not exhaustive by any means. The focus here was to come up with a set of recommendations which would be actionable or concrete enough that would be able to be applied to any of these case studies that we have taken into account, right? That was a bit of a challenge because we are looking, as we said, at 8 host countries and 5 countries of origin, all of them with their own sort of trajectory of political, social, economic development, and narratives, and so to be able to come up with recommendations which could be applied to all of them was a challenge in itself. So, but the idea behind those recommendations was that they would be, to a degree, actionable for all of those concerned, and at the same time they would be general enough so that they could apply to all of them in one way or another, right? From Germany to Lebanon to Turkey to Afghanistan to UK and so on and so forth. I would perhaps just mention a couple, which is when we talked about naturalization and access to citizenship at the beginning, one of the recommendations talks about encouraging governments to do more to commit in implementing more proactively, implementing more proactively Article 34 of the Refugee Convention of 1951 that talks about citizenship and naturalization, which is a necessary precondition for a meaningful, formal political participation for refugees in host countries. We have another set of recommendations which talk about governments at the countries of origin as well. Another set of recommendations which specifically target civil society organizations, political parties being another one. And in the end, of course, a couple of recommendations which also are directed at regional and or international organizations who also have a very interesting and active role to play in making the link between refugee communities and their involvement, participation in politics, formally or non-formally. Maybe another one that I could perhaps just dwell upon a little bit here without wanting to repeat what is verbatim on the screen is encouraging local authorities perhaps to do more to reach out to civil society organizations, to refugee communities, to various organizations that represent refugee communities on the ground, to make those links a little bit better, perhaps along the lines of consultative bodies in Germany or otherwise, so that they would act as a platform for their voices to be heard more actively. And for the rest, I don't know whether Lina wants to say a couple of words, or we'll just let it evolve.
Maybe just one final word about the Global Compact for safe, orderly and regular migration and the Global Compact on refugees, which are currently under intergovernmental negotiations. What we've seen with a lot of pleasure in the zero draft and also in the current first revised draft, we've seen that in particular in relation to the origin countries, one of the objectives of the Global Compact is that states, and in particular the origin countries, are encouraged to involve the refugee diaspora into post-conflict elections and into political transitions and peace negotiations. So the drafts of the Global Compact recognize the importance of the involvement of the diasporas in political processes back in the origin country for the stability and the sustainability of peace.
Okay, thank you very much to both of you for the overview, and we'll get back to you to dwell a bit on the further process after our panel discussion. So thanks for the time being.
Thank you very much,
Thanks a lot.
Christian.
All right, so now we'll head for a deep dive into the topic. And first of all, I'd like to invite Nora Ragab up on stage. She's doing research on the diaspora communities of Syrians and Afghans in Germany since quite a while, since 2012. No, I heard already you're in the field. And so she was the author also of the German case study. So Nora, welcome, and please pick your seat. All right, then we have, to really have also this comparison between countries, we have Shoaib Sharifi, who made it possible to be here today. He is working in Kabul again, meanwhile, as a BBC bureau of station. That's what they call it, right? Bureau chief. Okay, thank you very much. And just maybe take that chair. All right, then we have Ruvid Ziegler. He's associate professor for international refugee law at the University of Reading and made his way from the UK today. Thank you for being here. Have a seat. Maybe I'll simply take that one. And then we have Osama Salem. He's the founder of the Network for Refugee Voices, which is a network of actively politically engaged refugees that want to change a bit the way this topic is being dealt with and take a proactive stance on political participation. So welcome, Osama. And we have Tanja Berg. Tanja Berg is a political scientist and she works for MINOR, Projektkontor für Bildung und Forschung, and they are conducting education and research projects for many different disadvantaged groups in Germany, but also specifically for refugees. So welcome all of you, and I'll join you, but I should not forget my cards. So, Nora, let's start with you. And maybe as you've been doing that since a while and you know the field quite well, maybe when you conducted the field research, what was a surprising finding for you? You talked a lot to Syrian and Afghan communities here in Germany. Maybe what was a highlight from your field research?
I also want to thank Robert Bosch Stiftung and International IDEA for actually giving me the opportunity to engage in this very interesting research. For me, it was a very enriching experience as well. And I think actually the beauty of this study was that it challenges kind of the dominant narratives which exist when we talk about refugees or asylum seekers. Because normally refugees tend to be seen either as passive victims who are in need of help, or in Europe, maybe also in other contexts, they're increasingly seen also as kind of a risk to the host society. So, and the study, in my opinion, I mean, when talking to different persons, but also my experience, like from other research, is that it actually emphasized the refugees as political subjects. And I think this is something which, was for me the beauty of the study.
Perfect, thank you. Thank you so much. Shoaib, I heard that your field research took place in the UK right at the time of the elections, no? So that must have been politically anyway a pretty interesting time. Did you have any effects on your research, or how did that context play a role probably?
Well, it was quite, I think, surprising it was a surprise for me as a researcher perhaps me for the idea, as well as for the UK, even for Theresa May. Nobody knew that maybe in a month's time it's going to be an election. But it was a very good time, very good coincidence. At least we did benefit from the election results. I don't know whether the UK or Mrs. May herself benefited or not. Somehow we knew the rules in the UK that non-British residents, refugees and asylum seekers, except from the Commonwealth and Irish citizens, cannot vote. But what was a sort of a surprise or highlight that I learned, and I didn't know having lived there for a decade, that how a deprivation, being deprived of the right to participate directly in civic and political activities in the host country, have led refugees to strengthen or do more of non-political activities, and how, without having the right to vote, many said and believe that they still can make the change that they can expect from one single vote. So that was really somehow that deprivation of lack of the rights to participate in political activities have strengthened quite extraordinary the gathering of non-political participation in various forms and shapes.
Okay. So it was perceived as an important event by refugees, also in the country?
Well, the election was very, very taken very serious, particularly that obviously changes from certain parties, particularly Labour and Conservative, have their particular views on refugees, and so refugees were very closely following this, and even those I bumped into, talked to many who didn't have the right to vote, but they were campaigning for certain MPs, and they wanted a certain party to win because they knew that it would have immediate impact on their day-to-day lives.
Wow, okay, thank you. Well, Ruby, you wrote a book actually about voting rights for refugees, and so I consider, or apparently you consider it to be a very important topic. Could you make the case for us? Why is it such an important topic?
Right.
That will work.
It will work. Okay, perfect. So thanks very much. I want to say, as somebody who peer-reviewed this report, it was a particular pleasure, both because I think the report is excellent and topical, and I hope it does make good use. I mean, people like to say, bad practice travels quickly around the world. We only need to look at detention, offshoring of refugees, etc. So we hope good practice, the sort of good practice that the report does identify in respect of certain states, such as Sweden, will travel quickly and promptly as well. And yes, I think the other reason it was a pleasure to review this was precisely because I felt this area is underexplored, and it's underexplored precisely for the reason that was just mentioned earlier about the narrative around what a refugee means. And it's a narrative of assistance and humanitarianism, and it's not at the moment a narrative of agency and a narrative of, if you will, in the Hannah Arendtian sense, of somebody whose opinion is effective and actions are meaningful, to quote her from The Origins of Totalitarianism. What I argue in the book, and I think the report to a large extent corroborates, is that amongst those who are non-citizen residents in the world, refugees are a special category. And the reasons they're a special category goes to the heart of why it is that they're recognized as refugee. It is the fact that when they're recognized as refugees for an indeterminate period of time, indeterminate for the states that gives them status, indeterminate for them as well. They don't know how long it will last. It could be a very short period, but could be decades to go. If you think about somebody, say, who left Iran when the Shah fell, they may have thought there'll be a year or two, and they may still be in the respective countries of asylum. Once they're recognized as refugees, they lose by definition the protection of their country of origin. They cannot access its consular assistance or diplomatic protection. They have no realizable right to return to that country, which is the rights that international law grants an individual and is the corresponding right to the state's ability to control its borders. States can control their borders, but they have to let back their citizens in. Refugees can't go back to their countries of origin by definition because they have a fear of doing so. And as the report illustrates, even if formally, and in most cases they don't, even if formally they do have a right to participate in the elections of their country of origin if they are abroad, their ability to do so depends on the willingness of the country of asylum to allow for that participation, which, as we saw in the Syria case study, is in most cases non-existent. The ability of the state of origin to exercise effective mechanisms with the integrity of the vote, and indeed their ability to do so without losing their refugee status. And all of these are largely missing, and we see this in all of the case studies in the report. And so that kind of leads you to the state of asylum, and it is really in the state of asylum where refugees can have an effective political presence. And the report rightly identifies that at the moment, the only route to getting there on the national level is naturalization. There are only 4 countries in the world that let non-citizens vote in all elections. It's, you know, New Zealand, Chile, Malawi, and Uruguay, all of them after a pretty lengthy period of time. Even Sweden, which is singled out positively in the report, only allows refugees as other non-citizens to vote in local elections. And from my perspective, it is precisely the fact that refugees have no exit option, right? They cannot actually return. They are dependent on the state in which they have been granted asylum. They are dependent on the political system of that state. And so we heard about the elections in the UK. And it's very different if you're talked about in the elections or if you're part of the electorate in that election. We saw this with the Brexit referendum with EU 27 citizens who could not vote in the referendum and were clearly the subject of that referendum. And ultimately, and relatedly to the points about naturalization, I obviously would want to see Article 34 implemented and more access to naturalization. But it's also important to recognize that naturalization is not a panacea. And it's not a panacea because in some cases it would require renunciation of country of origin citizenship, which refugees do not often want to and should not be expected to do. It is an expensive process in some states. It is a laborious process, even if conditions will be would be tempered. And ultimately, you can think about voting, and this is the point I press in the book, as a step towards naturalization rather than a result of naturalization. In other words, it's the integration in the country of asylum that is facilitated by somebody being made part of that society, and as a result, consequently, also wanting to become permanently part of that society as a naturalized citizen.
Thank you very much for that good overview, Rui. I think there are a lot of points in there that we should take up. But first, I'd like to hand over to Osama, because apparently you didn't want to wait until you have full voting rights, or I don't even know about, but you decided to do something on your own. You founded the Network for Refugee Voices. What was the motive behind it, and why did you start, or why did you participate in that initiative?
So in democratic countries, when people are unable to take decision of their own future, we call it dictatorship. But when it comes to refugees, when they're unable to take decision for their own future or control, we call it humanitarian work. Basically, that's the motive came from there. And it goes back to the New York Summit in 2016 when a very small group of refugees that attended the New York Summit for the Global Compact on Refugees and Migrants. The number of people were attending there were extremely small. And it comes from some of those who attended, the refugees that attended, they approached refugee leaders, they approached refugee-led organizations, and they put them in one room together to actually, there was no idea, they just wanted to address the problem. But there was a momentum that last year, it was in April last year, where there was the beginning of the thematic sessions of the Global Compacts, and we managed to put through a declaration and a working plan. We managed to contact a lot of actors, a lot of governments, and we were invited to the thematic sessions, and we were actually trying to impose our opinion to politicians. We were meeting ambassadors and governments. And I have to say, I was very surprised that there are some governments that before that I thought they would be very resistant to the idea that a refugee would come and present their ideas and wanted to influence their decision, but they were actually very positive in taking those ideas. Because of that, we managed somehow, or that's the feeling among the group, that if you look 10 years ago and to see if refugees were able to participate in such a big scale decision-making process, it was unthinkable 10 years ago. And today, I mean, the idea is to mainstream that. The idea is to not to come back to the time where governments sit there and take decision to influence the future of marginalized group. And also, to echo Nora, it's also not to victimize refugees anymore. I mean, they are innovators, they are entrepreneurs, there are so many positive things that the society or host communities or governments sometimes don't address it, and we want to mainstream that.
Wow, thank you very much. Tanya, you have a lot of experience helping to create an enabling environment actually for participation and dealing with disadvantaged groups. Like, what is the relevance of this topic of political participation from your view?
Thank you, first of all, for inviting me, and also for this very interesting study, and especially for the case study on Germany. I think from our point of view, it's very important not to have an idea that participation or political participation only is something for citizens, or it's something that is only connected to the formal part. I think if you go back to democratic education, for example, you learn democracy while doing it, while practicing it. And you do this in daily life. And if democracy is not part of your daily life, in your thinking, in your acting, in the way how you try to find solutions for problems or for conflict situations, we'll all lose democracy. So especially people who are refugees, and if they are into political interest, then they have a real chance to inspire also their hosting countries with their experience and with their courage, and also with their abilities to cope with situations. And also they can be inspired by the hosting society. So I think this should be the key value of projects, of NGOs that are dealing with question of participation, especially for refugees, to address them as people with interest, with needs and with skills, especially in the democratic field. And what we do as an organization is in different fields focus on ways how you can encourage people to do so. Let's say in the field of refugees, for example, we are working with German volunteers. These German volunteers not necessarily have a German citizenship, but they are here for quite a time, and they're out in the field to help or to support or to work together with refugees, and a lot of them also are refugees themselves. And the idea is to help to develop skills and to use the chances of democracy where you can reach them, and to can do this in daily life.
maybe that's an opportunity, because we're, of course, it's a study that was conducted in 8 countries, or 8 host countries, but we're here now in Germany to go a bit deeper, perhaps also in the German debate, Tanya. And like, I may follow up on that. What relevance, because we've seen like the narrative changing again and again, and you've touched upon this, I think, and you also mentioned it. So this topic of political rights and political participation, what relevance do you see for it right now in the setting and in the status of the debate that we have in Germany?
Wow, a small question. I would say I think it has a very high relevance, actually, because if we see the whole German society, like more countries in Europe, into a change towards less, in my perspective, less democracy, less thinking about equality, about respect, about tolerance and diversity as a fact. Not even, doesn't matter if you compare it positive or negative. It's a fact that we are living in a world that is diverse and that we have to deal with it. And I think in a situation like in Germany these days, where we on one hand have the biggest amount of people ever that are volunteering to support newcomers on one hand, and it's still like this, even if the numbers are decreasing, it's still a huge amount of people who are doing this. And if you would count them as a political movement, you have a very strong movement in supporting refugees. So this is one hand, and you have now, and I'm very happy about this, more and more refugees organizing themselves, first of all, and getting organized in other NGOs and in a lot of different spheres of the German society. And I think if you want to increase this more, we also need a debate about giving more political rights. And you still have the right to be an active member in an NGO, and you have the right, of course, to say your opinion and to hopefully get heard. And but there are also limits, and I think we have to talk about the limits.
Okay. Yeah, well, there are some expectations or hopes also that might have for the current situation. Does that correspond also with what respondents told you or what your field research shows, Nora?
I think exactly this discursive dimension and the rising xenophobia, rising Islamophobia was actually perceived by many as a great challenge to be engaged. And maybe I can cite also, because I think it quite nicely fits to the things you said, Hannah, that Syrian activist, female activist, who said, you cannot feel that you are really integrated or that you are powerful unless you are involved in the local things happening. Being engaged here in Germany is very important because here are the tools, the freedoms to express yourself and freedom to believe in general. This is an opportunity. I believe that being socially and politically active is very important. And I think so it mentions both. It mentions on the one hand that Germany can also be for respondents an opportunity, or the German context, because you have the freedoms, you have the rights to actually engage in public discussions, to mobilize, to raise your opinions, to challenge other opinions. And I think specifically because the countries of origin like Afghanistan and Syria provided very limited space for political and civil engagement, actually the opportunities in Germany here were very much valued. At the same time, again, the rising discourse, rising xenophobia, rising right-wing mobilization was perceived as something which was very negative. And specifically because people felt that they always were perceived just as refugee. And again, it's the same narrative that people were not perceived as an active part of the society, or they felt not perceived as an active part of the society, but actually an outsider and not really part of the system. And I think the issue of belonging here was mentioned quite a lot in the interviews. But the issue of belonging is not just related to the discourse, but it's also related to the legal aspects of the German asylum procedure, of the citizenship and voting regimes. So for example, and this is also particular in the case of Afghan asylum seekers who actually had compared to Syrian asylum seekers a 50% of success rate for their asylum application. They also, the majority of the 50% had a ban on deportation, meaning that they are not really have a refugee or asylum right, which actually limits kind of the right to work, the right to family reunification. And this was also perceived by many as an obstacle to become involved in the society, because another Syrian activist, it wasn't somebody I interviewed, but in another event, she said it's a waiting room syndrome, because many people actually have maybe a legal status for 1 year, then they have to renew it. So it's very difficult for people to invest in building a new life when you are not really knowing that you can stay for a considered period of time. And I think, the discursive dimension, but then also related to the legal aspects, was something which I found very interesting.
So, but of course, these are very complex processes, and if I correctly understood it, in each country basically surveyed, it takes a long time still to become to achieve full citizenship, right? And to get full electoral rights. What would be interim solutions? And then maybe looking again at the details of informal ways of participation, but that question first to you, Ruby.
Yeah, so one thing that I found interesting kind of across the different case studies, and Germany is no exception in this case, but I believe Uganda was the exception, is that there are no formal barriers to becoming members of political parties for non-citizens in 7 of the 8 countries of Somali. And that's, of course, very significant because, as Shuaib said earlier, well, you could start being engaged politically in the country in which you reside, even if you cannot formally participate at that stage, and you can elect. I mean, it depends on the political system in the country, but in some political parties, you would be electing your representative of your party in the seats that is contested. That is the system in the UK in most political parties, and so that's a very good way for refugees to be engaged, and I think it kind of links to a point that Lena made, I think, earlier in the conclusions. Much of the current lack of involvement of refugees is due to that lack of awareness, right? It's due to a lack of awareness that, for instance, the fact that you are not able to vote does not mean that you cannot join a political party. That is significant. I mean, I would want to see them being able to vote, but I think in the absence of that, it's very significant that they are considered people whose voice could be relevant for the political discourse, and indeed that doing so is not in any way treasonous or endangering their status as a refugee in the country, which some people in the report in various countries, not in this country, but in others, have expressed. Now, I want to also link this to the point Nora made about the kind of vulnerability of status. Now, of course, part of the problem, and it's a problem for Germany, but it's a problem for other countries as well, of bypassing the regular refugee convention route and having different statuses that are more insecure and vulnerable is, of course, in addition to the fact that they often carry reduced social and economic rights, they also create a space where somebody feels less secure in their long-term residence, and as a result feel less invested in that society, less likely to want to integrate into that society, even if formally they are able to. So there is, as you were, an overarching theme here as well, which is to say it is also in the interest of the country of asylum to make it a place where people feel they might be able to stay, because then they're more likely to want to be engaged and they're more likely to integrate. Now, this is, of course, to link it back to your discussion earlier about the politics of this. Now, of course, this assumes the countries of asylum want to create that space. Rhetorically, some of them at least want to. And so, in a way, what needs to happen is a link between the rhetoric, the politics, and the law.
And okay, maybe to elaborate a bit further on this topic of informal ways of participation and to compare these two cases, no? Like in Germany, we have heard already that there are these consultative bodies. Is there anything comparable in the UK, or what are informal ways of participating in the UK for refugees?
Well, could I just add one more?
Yes,
to that,
please.
last
Yes.
Conversation. The interest of non-eligible voters, i.e. refugees and asylum seekers, in participating in being members of political parties, it's sort of like one way. Like the other way around, the politicians or local MPs, I was told by our interviewees that a local MP would take that community. It depends the size of your voting size or voting community. They look at them rather than a community. So in the UK, refugees, for example, from Commonwealth countries, they have the right to vote, but not obviously the Afghans. And in one instance, they had complained to a local MP why the MP didn't attend the Afghan community gatherings, and they were saying that, well, if you can prove to me that you will have certain number of voters, I would take you serious and I will raise that issue that you're saying, I will raise that in the parliament. So it's sort of a bit one way in that sense. Excuse me. Regarding the non-political participation, somehow this deprivation from political participation have sort of forced the Afghan refugees and asylum seekers to have their own ways of gathering and discussing politics. And it is somehow, it has got its pros and cons. Obviously, the pros are that at least there is somewhere to go to discuss politics. In a gathering, there may be 2 legible British Afghans and 8 nuns. So if this 8 can somehow convince these 2 voters, they would achieve something. But the cons, I would say, is somehow keeping the refugees in their bubble, because they can't be integrated. They have to still remain in their own bubble. But ease in the law have caused many to form groups, unions, without even registering certain numbers. So you don't have to register certain groups, social gatherings, poetry, discussions. And obviously the social media have completely changed the definition of the limitation of how much you can do. So somehow now some groups are convincing the MPs, although we don't have this big number of voters, but we can do socially on social media. We can somehow help so that we matter.
Maybe looking again at Germany then, like what are dominant forms of non-formal participation that you've seen here? I mean, you touched upon the issue of party participation or party membership. You already explained a bit about that consultative bodies. So how does that work, and where would you see strengths maybe we could build on, and where do you see challenges?
Regarding the consultative bodies, I would also a bit agree that it's kind of, because there are no rights, okay, we create these bodies and then at least we have formal channels that we can say we involve. And I mean, the composition and of the advisory function or the rights the bodies have really depend on the municipality often or on the regional level. It's written down in the constitution, so it varies a lot. In some cities you see that they have really also a few or limited decision-making power, when others they really are just have an advisory functions. Also, not all the bodies actually include the refugee population, because in some, for example, in Cologne, you are only allowed to participate in the election for the advisory body if you have a permanent residence in Germany. So it's not actually that the majority of refugees or asylum seekers would be able is covered. And I think this is something, I mean, they still did a lot of work in reaching out with refugee organizations and refugee communities. So of course they can be kind of having a bridging function, but it's not necessarily that this group is really represented in these bodies. And I think this is something which is also important to mention. And from the other means of non-formal engagement, and I think Osama can also talk a bit more in depth about it, but what I actually saw, there has been a lot of protests even, demonstrations, where actually people even, I talked to people who didn't even have a legal status here in Germany, but they actually organized a lot of protests and demonstrations over months and days to actually advocate for their right, and kind of demands were the right to family unification or equal opportunity, strong integration opportunities, because in Germany, for example, you only have the right to attend an orientation or integration course sponsored by the ministry if you are from a country which is not considered as safe. And Afghanistan, for example, is considered as a safe country. Therefore, actually, Afghan people, asylum seekers are not eligible to the integration course offered by BAMF, but there are cities, for example, like in Berlin, they actually then included people who are also not from a safe, who were from a safe country. At the same time, what I also want to emphasize that it's not just about the political protest that refugee-led movements can do, but it's also about the way they also empower other asylum seekers and refugees. So many actually engage in kind of providing orientation, providing even themselves integration courses, providing opportunities for non-school education for children. And I think this is something very important, because also through these programs, which are not necessarily political by its nature, but still they can serve to empower the population also to engage civically.
Osama, maybe what would it need to build on that dynamic that you were describing and that excitement that then also was created when people felt, "Ooh, wow, we can do something, we can actually be a network of active influencers, not that have a role in that." So what would it need to make that work in a more midterm, long-term perspective?
So I'll start with a challenge that any informal representation or informal participation would face is as Nora mentioned, it's the residence status, for instance. But what you need to overcome this is you need a focal point somehow, and that's we at the network we created something like this. I'll give a concrete example. So we feed directly to the Global Compact, and we feed directly to it. As we were invited by many organizations to do, and now we hold an observatory seat for the consultations. So how do we feed to it? We see the draft, for instance, the zero draft. Every member of the group in the group from the network would distribute or consult with their refugees, because they are leaders of communities or refugee-led organizations, and they take the recommendations, what's good, what's not, what we want, and basically we go, we meet ambassadors in Geneva, and we feed this to them. And basically, we couldn't do this without also support from some governments. I mean, the German government, the Dutch, Sweden, for instance, there are some governments as well that actually supported this initiative a lot. And to be honest, they are taking the recommendation. And I'm not saying the recommendations they are taking are exclusive from us. No, these are very legitimate points that have been brought by many activists, many researchers. But actually, they're taking it into consideration. And we see it in the ground. We see it inside the consultation that, for instance, the German would give a speech, and they actually bring up some points that we actually talked about or other activists talked about. One of the dangers in this approach would be not to tokenize refugees, not to bring this way of consulting refugees only to check the box, only to say, you know, we talked, unfortunately it didn't work, or, you know, and this is the danger of it. Now, what we're trying to do to avoid this is to create a force that you cannot ignore. I mean, maybe some in the audience heard about this, but we have been working with some organizations. We're organizing now a global summit of refugees that's going to take place in June in Geneva, prior to the UNHCR NGO consultation. And the idea is actually to build a larger network, a stronger, and to be more connected, to have that actually cohesive, strong force of voice of refugees that cannot be ignored anymore.
Very interesting, thank you. Like maybe one more point towards you, because there are often high hopes also with regard to the role of the diaspora in political processes in the countries of origin, right? Like that they can be a force of democratization, and that they can be agents of change to a certain degree, and bring back basically also democratic practices, governance models, not back to the countries of origin. So how do you see that? And of course, then I would also touch upon the issue of out-of-country voting that we've heard about before.
Yeah, I think it's extremely important as well to have the lesson learned from democratic societies like here in Germany or Sweden, and somehow convert it to the values, social values in other countries, in countries of origin. And we've seen it in, I'll mention Syria, and I mention Afghanistan because I actually met some activists that actually worked on building democratic values, maybe in Syria, not much now. But in Afghanistan, I met people in Australia that are actually working brilliant projects to bring those values converted to values that are acceptable in countries of origin, and moving on to building peace and democracy. So it's an extremely important point, but also it's touching to the, referring back to what you mentioned before, is also it's always this point versus the point of having another citizenship in the country of asylum, whether you are legitimate anymore to actually do that change in the country of origin or not. And it's, in the end, it's a choice also of a refugee to decide how they want to approach the issue later on.
Maybe just shortly to you, because if I'm informed correctly, I mean, you got a British passport now, no? That means you're out of the game in Afghanistan, or how is that?
Well, in Afghanistan, for having been in the war for 3 decades, so the country didn't have a real, proper, meaningful democratic institutions. And right after the 2001 post 9/11 events and the collapse of Taliban regime, so there was a massive demand for people with expertise to build those democratic institutions, and obviously the foreign expertise was very costly, and it opened the door for return of many very expert Afghans. Excuse me. So the democratic institution building in Afghanistan, the backbone of that was the Afghans who already had gained some sort of experience in the West. And some of the leading TV stations, for example, in Afghanistan was initiated by Afghans returning from Australia, as Osama pointed. And one of the reasons was the passport that is a license to travel. So the inability to go around immediately qualifies you to be hired. In fact, actually, to participate for the workshop, idea workshop, I hadn't actually obtained my British citizenship. I had to wait for quite some time, go through so many interviews. I was all about to miss actually this just simple deadline of workshop in Sweden because I couldn't travel having the right documents as Afghan national living in the UK. And just by good coincidence, I obtained my passport and I managed. So it's a small example that it really enables, you may have the expertise, but if you don't have the passport, you cannot somehow go back to your country of origin and you cannot travel beyond to really practice what you have gained and achieved.
But formally, you're not an Afghan citizen anymore, right?
No, actually, that's the beauty of it, at least so far, that dual citizenship in Afghanistan up to the below ministerial level. Actually, up to some years ago, you could be a minister and have a dual citizenship. So unless I decide to become a minister or the president in future, so I could have my dual citizenship. But many of our Afghan MPs, provincial council members, return from the West, and somehow, in fact, having this dual citizenship for many Afghans gives them the courage to go to the country of origin. And again, if push comes to shove, if again he or she is subject to any pressure or threats, so he or she has got that document to return. Somehow the non-dual citizen Afghans taunt you in saying that, oh yeah, you have got your passport, of course you're saying this, and when there's a pressure, you'll run away. But I would say it is, yes, that is the case, and that's why people have dared to go back, to participate, to contribute as far and then until they can. And there's always sort of that escape route or guarantee that you could go back to safety if it's a difficult day.
Well, that's for me a totally new aspect of the dual citizenship debate, Ruby. I mean, maybe you could elaborate a bit, because that seems to be quite relevant also for the question of formal participation.
Yeah, so there are two things that I pick up from this. I mean, one is the far less idealistic, far less charitable view of one's passport is that a passport is as valuable as the ability of the state that you enter on that passport to expel you back to your country of origin. And the reality is the reason why countries would not easily grant a visa to an Afghani, certainly not to an Eritrean or a Syrian, is because of their fear, substantiated by their data, that they won't be able to send that person back. Whereas on a British passport, at least at the moment, unless there's been a hostile takeover of the political system whilst I was away, it's still considered a country to which one can return. So I can definitely see how in a rather peculiar way having another passport could be seen as an advantage in the political system of those countries. But I think the other point that was highlighted here is, of course, the question around citizenship being seen as the ultimate prerogative of states in a world, in an international system of nation states, is entirely arbitrary, in the sense that one can have 2, 5, 10 citizenships as long as each of those respective countries are happy for you to have other citizenships. One could end up being stateless because of nationality law, and one could have a position like in Germany where if you're first generation, you have to choose. You couldn't pick up German citizenship and retain Afghani citizenship in Germany. It used to be the case also for second generation, right? For migrants, that only changed fairly recently. And so the idea that for refugees this is an obvious possibility, right, is again, is the case in some instances where refugees get status, and is not the case in others. I think the other important element here is the relevance of re-engaging yourself with the political system of your country of origin when that country undergoes transformation. It's a point we made earlier as well. It's a point that was made obviously in Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban. It was most clearly articulated internationally when at least the first phase of the conflict in the Balkans ended, where the Dayton Accords explicitly state that refugees will be expected to be able to participate in elections in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and that would happen in tandem with their repatriation and return. Now, not all of them returned, but many of them did, and it was seen to be two processes that go hand in hand. The idea that circumstances have changed so that there is actually now a meaningful electoral process in your country of origin, which probably, from the state of asylum's perspective, means you can go back. Now, if you had acquired citizenship and you retain that citizenship of the country of origin, you're in the privileged position, like Jaib, that can decide whether to go back and decide to stay. If you haven't acquired the citizenship of the country of asylum, the country of asylum can tell you at that stage to go back. And that is why having the possibility to naturalize without giving up your country of origin citizenship is ultimately the best kind of security a refugee can have.
How was that seen by your interviewees? I remember also one quotation, or where actually they rejected the idea. I think it was a Syrian respondent. They rejected the idea of out-of-country voting. What was the context? Could you elaborate that a bit?
I think in both cases, to the participant I talked to, many perceived, both in Afghanistan and Syria, that both countries don't provide a huge space for formal political engagement. I mean, in Afghanistan, I think corruption and instability was frequently mentioned, a huge mistrust also in both contexts in political systems and actors, and I think therefore there was actually not a strong willingness to engage formally. But at the same time, what I saw, and in line what you said, that there has been a lot of initiatives, both in from the Afghan diaspora and the Syrian diaspora, engaging in the origin country and mainly focusing on civil society, focusing on education, focusing on strengthening civil society actors in the country of origin. And I think this, especially the role of civil society, was seen as crucial also in the country of origin, because the perceived lack or the actual lack of actually political opportunities and yeah, in the Syrian country, of course, it's an ongoing conflict, and very open ongoing conflict, and there, some respondents actually perceived it as a coercion of, rather than a real right to engage in the political system, as it would legitimate the current government. So yeah, this was something, but at the same time, again, migrant or refugee civil society organization engaged in the origin country was really something positive. But I also wanted to a bit more critically discuss the issue of return and participating in the political system, because I think also, and this is also one finding of a colleague of mine who did research on return in the Afghan case, and she actually saw that those people, I mean, that the whole migration cycle played a role in your return situation at the end, because many who came on a legal, regular way to Europe were able to maintain a secure status, were able actually to engage in work or in education, and therefore were also much more able to have a stronger position once they returned to Afghanistan, whereas many who actually came through irregular channels had a very insecure status, often with very limited rights, and then returned, actually found themselves in a much more marginalized situation than actually before the migration. And I think this also a bit to dismantle the term refugee, because again, we talk always about refugees and asylum seekers as being a homogeneous group, but we see very different people with very different opportunities, and I think this should be also maybe discussed.
Yeah, maybe Tanya, you want to add up on that issue, no? Like, because that touches upon like how fast and how far do you go here with integration measures, no? And I think that's a field of work you're of course engaged in. What is your opinion on that?
Yes, I think this is true, right? We are not talking, refugees are not a homogeneous group. And what we see here in Germany, if you talk about participation in a broader sense, you need the ability to be allowed to study and to be allowed to get a professional status, first of all on the legal sense, but then also the encouragement. If you look at the situation of a lot of women refugees coming, not in this case, not from Syria, but from other countries, for them, that some of them haven't attended school for a long time and need a different kind of support in learning abilities and reach a status to come into an economic independence, will also encourage them further on to be politically active, either here or if they want to go back to their land of origin, also to benefit from the time they have spent here. And on the other hand, you have here also female refugees who are professors in their land of origin and are not allowed to teach at university to cause of question of law, and for them you need different other programs to make them the ability to be an active part of society. And I think we here have, this is just one case, I think you can look at a lot of different aspects that we need to look very sharply on whom we are working with and whom we are talking to. And I think this is one of the things I appreciate in the moment about a lot of programs that are done in German society. For example, Mina is involved in a qualification project for migrants and also for refugees, and it's a network of organizations who are trying to enable people to come to a job or to even a better qualification. And I think this is very important on one hand, even if it's not part of political participation, but for some people this is also a tool to get involved more in society, to meet more people, to meet them on a more equal base. And if I meet other people who are living here for a longer time and they treat me on a more equal basis, I get more interested in society. And there's also more, it's more attractive to become also an active member of this society, I would say.
Thank you very much. If I understand both of you correctly, it's about, even from a very pragmatic perspective, basically saying, let's shorten the time in the waiting room. Yeah, because even if it means sending back, it's far more promising for both parties involved, basically, if integration measures kick in early and consequently. Yeah? Okay. Thank you very much. I would open now a bit the discussion also to the audience. I know there might be some questions and I already see some hands. I would suggest that I take 2-3 questions and that you also mention whom you direct it to here on the panel, or if it's a general comment.
I'm Chris Nash from the European Network on Statelessness. You know, I was interested listening to Ruhi. He quoted Hannah Arendt, and you know, another famous quote from the Origins of Totalitarianism is that, you know, stateless people lack the right to have rights. And you know, I think that's starkly very true in that they lack, in terms of formal political participation. It's impossible both in their country of origin and in the host country. But I think, you know, where they're in an even worse position than Rui described, people lacking an exit option, and they're in an even worse position in the waiting room in that they often have no chance to be identified or to regularize their status, even as a precursor to being able to then subsequently naturalize. So I think that's, you know, I'd be interested in terms of a question whether the research spoke to any stateless people. But moving on to the question of informal political participation, you know, again, they face an added barrier in that, unlike refugees who may have travel documents, they may not even be able to travel to participate in some of the events Osama described, for example. And we're doing some research at the moment looking at the link between stateless and forced migration. And what's really interesting is talking to some of the stateless people about how they themselves feel particularly isolated compared to other communities. Not only they are not homogenous, but often as stateless people, they're not even self-identifiable as part of a group. They're citizens of nowhere, unless they come from, you know, well-recognized stateless communities like Kuwaiti Badoons or Palestinians or Syrian Kurds. So I really welcome the report, you know, the recommendation in the report that it's incumbent on NGOs like mine to increase our community engagement approach, you know, to make sure that what we do respects the agency, rather to see ourselves as representing people, but to share the advocacy space. And my second question would be to Osama. You know, in our sector, we talk a lot about how we can share capacity with community-led organizations, but to flip that round, you know, how as NGOs can we learn from community-led organizations about how we can better collaborate? And you mentioned the Refugee Summit, which is one forum for that, but I'd be interested if you had any other thoughts on that.
Perfect. Maybe we take one more, and or if not, well, then I'd say then we leave it directly to you, Ruby and Osama. The two of you were addressed.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Obviously, I agree with you. I think the situation, so the worst situation would be for somebody who was a stateless refugee. And of course, the Refugee Convention does not exclude that possibility, nor does it say that statelessness is automatically a basis for refugee status, and it's a cause now for significant and important research that I think it's an area that's been underexplored, and we talked about this earlier, and certainly deserves more attention. I think the point I would make is, of course, for people, so whereas for refugees who do have a nationality, and that nationality is in many respects ineffective, but it may, as you were, become effective again. It may be dormant and be reignited. Naturalization in the country of origin is a prospect that we should aspire to, that the Refugee Convention, certainly in Article 34, recommends, and that should be available to them in a faster, less intrusive, less laborious process than it is to other migrants, for the reasons that we've discussed earlier. But it is possible for them to have remedies rather than naturalization, precisely because they can have specific rights attached to their refugee status, and they can in future regain an effective citizenship. For people who are stateless, the remedy is evident, right? The remedy must be naturalization, and I think what that highlights, though, it goes back to the point I made about the arbitrary nature of nationality and the fact that people can have 2, 5, 10, or 0, right? It's the fact that international law in this area is still weak. It is arguably getting stronger in respect of denationalizing somebody if the effect is to make them stateless. But it is still weak in terms of requiring states to naturalize somebody if the alternative is that they remain stateless. Even the European Convention of Nationality includes several exceptions which allow states to still leave parts of their population as stateless. And that, I think, in addition to the obvious effect that has on their political participation for the reasons we've discussed, it has effects on a plethora of other elements of their life, because at least refugee status is, to the extent that states comply with their obligations under international law, in the European Union, under the European Qualification Directive, at least there are certain obligations that the states undertake that attach to it directly as a status. The problem, as Chris highlighted, is that if you're stateless, you might be in the shadows legally, and thus also in terms of your actual provision of rights.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris, for the question. In fact, so refugee-led organizations or the majority of them, if not all, they have the first-hand experience of the refugee, the flight, basically, the problems that they face before, during, and after arriving to country of asylum, and everything that follows as well. Now we've seen the interest of so many countries to actually hear this. I mean, maybe countries like Germany, they didn't need to hear it on an international level, to see us in Geneva or New York. But there are many other countries that actually needed to hear from the refugees directly those problems and suggested solutions. And we found that it's a mutual interest, that the refugee would come and sit next to a high official from a government in Geneva or New York and tell them, that's my problem and that's my proposed solution. And they have the exact interest to hear that and take it into consideration, because there is this also thirst of understanding or knowing what a certain segment of refugees in certain country feel like, or what do they think about certain policies. Also, I mean, just to mention this and correlated maybe to the voting rights and direct formal participation, we've seen this in the case of Australia as well. Sometimes refugees in some countries, they cannot practice political pressure because they are unable to vote or they don't have the right documents. But actually, if you also think of it this way, if this certain group of refugees that are unable to practice political rights in national level, if they are able to go to international level and put pressure from the top down, that actually could work as well. And we've seen this as well. To also just answer a part of your question, not to me, I mean, not the question, but you mentioned the traveling or the freedom of movement, which is also an obstacle to attend somewhere else, to participate in conferences or in meetings. Actually, we also managed somehow to, many other organizations as well, to delegate certain attendance to somebody else. For an example, if there's something in Berlin that's happening and somebody from Australia is interested to come but they were denied a visa, I would go for that person and I would refer back and I would report back. And that's, in this case, we managed to cover somehow an important event for somebody somewhere else in the world without them being able to travel. Of course, it would be nice that if they would have come personally, but it's still a way of jumping off that fence.
Can I add just a quick footnote to this, which is, and it kind of goes back to points about good practice and indeed in this context just complying with obligations. What the Refugee Convention requires is that if somebody gets refugee status, then the state that gives them asylum must issue them a convention travel document, which means that they're not landlocked. They can travel, and that travel document is intended to serve in lieu of their passport, precisely because they can't use the passport of their country of origin. When states recognize people as refugees under the Refugee Convention, they actually issue those normally. The problem, going back to the discussion we had about Germany and Syria, is that if you get a status of protection that is not refugee status, then one of the ways in which the state then doesn't fully provide you the whole gamut of rights is, for instance, not to issue that travel document, and that obviously, from the discussion we've just had, has a direct impact on your ability to exercise your agency.
Thank you. So let's check again if there are more questions or comments, and otherwise I would give the panelists the chance for a short statement. Yeah.
Thank you. Rafaela Schweiger from Robert Bosch Foundation. My question would be a bit more practical, looking at the German perspective. We see at the moment also in policy debates, but also in terms of funding, many projects and funds given by the government on orientation courses, value courses, the wish to now just a few days ago there was in the media something about constitutional state classes for refugee children in schools. So there is the wish to somehow teach democracy. There was a huge study, and is still going on, by the BAMF and the IAB sub-study. The Germans in the room will know it, where a lot of refugees were interviewed, also in terms of values on their reference to the constitutions, to democracy, where actually the figures said, well, we almost have the same values as Germans when it comes to democracy, but what does it mean in practice? And as we now have finally a new government, and we have a lot of money out there for also that topic, my question would be, what should be done in practice, and what can governments and actors do that actually want democratic education? I would say, if you look at it in terms of money, that would be what do we need? What is going right and what is going wrong in that context?
I mean, Tanya, I see you might want to answer on that one.
Oh, yeah, great question. I would be happy if I would have a clear answer, and maybe I would be in charge for a lot of more things. But no, I think what we really need is to open spaces. I think it's very good to have all these programs, and I think it's always good to give money into civic education on different levels for different groups in different ages, in different fields. Because as I said before, you learn democracy only while experience it, and while doing it, and while you discover that you are a person that can create spaces and that can develop together with others solutions in communication or with other tools. So what I think what we need additionally, more spaces where people could meet on an equal base, refugees and people who are living here for different periods of time with different interests, and to open up more maybe on a grassroots level, this idea of political topics. What is interesting for people, and there we are going to the new social movements in Germany. People very often are interested in the questions of their neighborhood. They're interested in what is happening in the kindergarten, or what is happening in if I'm not heterosexual, how can I be active in a more friendly homosexual context, and how can I develop the skills to be out of the closet? Things like this. I think there's a wide range of topics that are important for people, and are also important for refugees, and where they meet people that have the same interest, and where they can also develop together more and different forms of democratic action. This is what I see, and how to do it concrete. Well, good question. I think we have to work on it.
Nora and Osama will answer that now.
No, what actually I found, not just in this study, and colleagues found in also other studies, interviewing a lot migrant or diaspora organization, was actually always a lack to access to financial resources. And I think it's very nice to see that there is money available, but I think it should be also accessible actually to refugee-led or migrant-led organizations, and to empower them also to become more sustainable. Because I think in many studies really looking at Kenya and other groups in Germany, the majority always relied on donations, relied on membership fees to engage. And I think, enhancing the capacity of migrant or refugee-led organizations through actually giving funding also to these groups would be important, in my opinion, or practical solution. But it's also, so for example, many interviews also said that not just about the access, but also how to manage the funds, because often bigger organizations or more established organizations receive the funds because they have also resources to actually manage the funds they get, the transparency, the accountability issues. So I think it could be a way, and this exists also on a lot, specifically on local level, but it could be also more on national level, that there are funding streams actually targeting migrant organizations. And what exists also is often that they have to cooperate with other organizations, which is good, but I think also it should be really targeting migrant or refugee-led organization alone. And maybe just briefly another example of more political education, which was also mentioned in the case study. So I did an interview with Heinrich Böll Foundation in NRW, of NRW, and they actually did a workshop with persons with a refugee background and not non-refugee background on political education. What they actually found, that there were a lot of resources, a lot of knowledge even on systems, but that there were exactly the need for more living, practicing democracy. But they also found that it's when you do such a work with people from diverse backgrounds, you need also much more resources than maybe in a normal political education work, because you might need translators, you might need somebody who has a specific training, maybe also in conflict mediation or conflict sensitivity, because you often also deal with people who experience trauma, maybe also who have, again, negative perceptions towards political institutions because of their experience in their home country. So I think acknowledging the resources which there are, but also the special needs of the specific target group would be maybe my recommendation.
Thank you. Osama.
I think one of the main problem is, or how I see it is, refugees are they come from. I mean, we should see where they're coming from. They come either from conflict or from very oppressing regimes. They have been told what to do all their life long. Then they come here, and then they put them in an integration course. It's not because they're putting them into the integration course, because they're telling them to you have to do it. I think it's that they're making them do it rather than they choose it. Somehow all the decisions that are being taken, they don't own these decisions. They have been dictated, these decisions, even here. I mean, obviously it's difficult to say what the solution is, but it definitely should start from the first day they arrive here. I'm totally against. I mean, I see it starts with the point where the government register them and then they put them in camps for 6 months or so. That's the case in Berlin. Of course, you don't start this kind of integration sitting with the same persons you actually traveled with. Where's the integration? Another point that I would like to refer to is actually, I think, I'm not sure if you agree with me, but I think integration is also both ways. I mean, it's not only the refugees should integrate to the society, it's also the society should accept and integrate some of their culture or practices. And when they see that happening, they accept the other, the culture they're living in.
Thank you very much. Well, I would give basically the two of you, if you want to add upon that, an opportunity also for some final statement, and then I would hand over to Lina and Armand to give us an outlook a bit on the process.
I just wanted to point to the gender in terms of findings in UK case study. Interestingly, right now, a young Afghan refugee woman is a candidate in a local election, so most likely we may have the first Afghan refugee to win a local election. She sounds positive, will be a woman, but in a bigger picture, unfortunately, the social barriers have traveled with the refugees to host countries, and both in formal and non-formal political participation, I found, yes, there's a very vibrant political motivation among the refugees and asylum seekers, but sadly, the participation of women is very pale. both the voters and non-eligible voters, women seem to be far, far more behind, and their presence is very pale in both formal and non-formal. And just one more point, that in the UK, not many refugees know that there is a discrimination. You are not having the right to be you cannot be in the electorate register until you're a citizen. And whoever's name is not in the electoral register, his credit will be affected. He may, but his credit will be affected when he's applying for a loan and for certain other privileges that somebody whose name is in the electoral register, he would have a better privilege than the person who is not. So it's a very obvious discrimination that the system has there, and you don't know until your loan application is refused and you find out, oh, because your name is not in the local register. So it's not just about the right to vote, but there are certain other things that you will lose not being able to be registered in the electoral register.
So I think I'll just make one kind of general observation, which I think links very much to Osama's point about starting from day one. I think the key element, and links to discussions earlier about precarity and status and how integration is two-way. I think the perception that states must have, and clearly generally don't, is that the person who is entered will remain long-term. It is possible that they won't. Right? It's entirely possible they won't, either because they won't want to or they won't need to. But if they start from the premise that they will, then it's far more likely they'll be able to integrate. It's far more likely, as you say, there's seclusion. And of course, some of the case studies are much more favorable or charitable than some other cases globally where encampment is pervasive and is the general practice. I mean, here we're talking about shorter terms, but nonetheless, I mean, the earlier one has access to communication with general society. I mean, I entirely agree also with Tanya's point about localism, about connecting on issues where there's common interest and common grounds. The more states do this, I mean, it's also the moral thing to do, right? And it's also an agency enhancing prospect. But it's also instrumentally wise, because if they end up staying longer, and as I mentioned at the start, the states just don't know. It is entirely possible they will stay long term and it will be outside that state's hand. If they end up staying long term, the shorter the period at the start before integration, the better it will be for the state and its citizens as well.
Thank you very much. I think I'd leave it at that and thank the panelists for this open and frank discussion, and would invite Lina and Armand up again to give us a short outlook maybe to how this process will continue. Like you want, yeah. Ihr dürft auch sitzen bleiben, like you want. I told them there are no nice chairs down there, and also stay seated for the last 2 minutes. All right, yeah, so that was an intensive discussion, but of course, that was now the Germany case, no? And you were talking about 8 host countries. So, Lina and Armand, what's going to happen next? So, what will IDEA and Robert Bosch Foundation do and to spread the message?
So this was the first launch in a series of launches and of activities to spread the message and to start putting the issue on the table. Next week we will be in Kampala, in Uganda, on the 26th of April for a similar panel discussion, but focusing on the sub-Saharan Africa context. And along the lines and trying to solve the issue of what next and how could we do things better, how could we implement the recommendations. We completely agree with Osama's and Tanya's view that yes, more consultation is needed, consultation of the refugees themselves rather than us sitting behind our desks and designing projects for refugees without refugees. So departing from this point, we will also be hosting a workshop in Kampala with refugee representatives and representatives of the local communities and of organizations working with refugees, and trying to get their perspectives on what we can do to operationalize the recommendations. Then on the 10th of May, we are presenting the findings in Tunis, and we will focus on the Mediterranean context. We will present specifically the Turkey and the Lebanon cases and discuss the issue in the Eastern Mediterranean countries. And this is, there is a point that I would like to highlight here, and is also reflected in the report, and especially in the cases of Turkey and Lebanon, that not all countries are signatories of the Refugee Convention. And for example, in the MENA region, which is the region that has been very much affected by the Syrian refugee crisis, so-called, there are countries like Lebanon, which 25% of the population is refugees, including Syrians and Palestinians, but also people from other origin countries, where the Refugee Convention has not been ratified, and therefore the state does not consider that they are bound to recognize the international refugee status. So there are other challenges related to this that are mentioned in the report. And we are also presenting the report in Brussels on the 24th of May. And we will bring the issue up to the European Union level and try to discuss what can be done from the regional perspective. And lastly, in Stockholm, on the 31st of May and the 12th of June, we will have a conversation focusing specifically on the Swedish context, and also in view of the upcoming elections in Sweden. So we're really looking forward to the debate. And you can, as you see, you can download the report and all the 8 case studies on International Ideas website. It is now public and released.
All right. Thank you very much for that outlook. So the journey continues. And yeah, I'd say I'd leave it at that. No, I think you nicely summarized the most important parts of our discussion. And Anna, if I'm correctly informed, we're invited to reception now here. So that will be right here in the room. So please stay on for some personal exchange also. And very many thanks to Robert Bosch Foundation for organizing it, for you for preparing it so well, and for you participating and being such lively discussant. Yeah, so thank you all, and let's come together for the reception.
It's an